Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
But for many of you, this is already your second class, which is a rough Thursday morning to have 3 hours in a row, but you manage. So welcome back. Today we're going to be talking mostly, so last week we talked a lot about the demand curve, and we talked a lot about consumers and the incentives for consumers. Today we're going to be doing basically the same exercise, but from the producer side, from the firm side. We will also, towards the end, talk about combining these a little bit, and we'll combine these and talk about demand and supply. But as I say, for the most part today, we're going to be talking about the supply schedule rather than the demand schedule, producer surplus rather than consumer surplus, so the same kinds of arguments. Time permitting, we will talk about elasticity at the end of the day today. I do not anticipate having time to talk about this, but it's there in case we have time. We may have time, so we'll see how we go. To start off, some light admin, so just notice on upcoming assessments, because they are now upcoming reasonably soon. Problem set 1 will be released, is due on Tuesday of week 5, and will be released no later than Tuesday of week 4. This is a relatively small assignment. It's worth 7.5%, so it's worth a reasonable amount. It's not nothing, but it is intended to be a relatively small, not too difficult assignment. I can talk more about this next week if you'd like. Oh, no, I won't. I'll talk about all of it now. It'll be a sequence of problems in the style of some of the tutorial problems, so in the style of those tutorial problems that are accessible type tutorial problems for the most part. And it's just you produce written solutions, you submit them online in the standard way you've done all assignments, and you will do all assignments. Again, this is intended to be a relatively small piece of work. Which will be due Tuesday of week 5, and will be released. I intend to release it on Monday, but if I don't release it on Monday, I will release it by Tuesday. Just as a quick note, the personal project, which is due in week 10 or 11, I have to double check. I'll talk more about that next week. The mid-semester exam, the draft timetable, I want to really emphasize that, the draft timetable for the mid-semester exam has been released, and on that draft timetable, the mid-semester exam is on Tuesday of week 7. So this is just to let you know in advance. So in the draft timetable, it's Tuesday, week 7, this is subject to change. It doesn't normally change, but it can change. Otherwise, any queries, questions about upcoming assessments? Yep.
For the mid-sem exam, are we able to anticipate what's expected for that?
I will talk much more about expectations for the mid-semester exam in week 6, in the lecture in week 6. The question was about expectations in the mid-semester exam. I can let you know a little bit now. It'll be a two-parter, so two components. The first component will be true, false, or uncertain questions, and the second component will be more extended response. Will be sort of multi-part, longer response questions. But I'll talk more about that in week 6. Otherwise, any questions about assessment? Lovely. Some additional admin. In week 7, the lecture on week 7, so Thursday of week 7 is a public holiday, and so there are no classes on Thursday week 7. So that class that would be on Thursday week 7 will instead be on Monday of week 8. So that's the 29th of April from 3 to 5 p.m. So there will not be the lecture in week 7, the week 7 lecture will not happen in week 7. It'll happen on Monday of week 8. Because Thursday week 7 is public holiday. The tutorials in week 7 may be cancelled. I'm tossing up whether to include them or not. It's possible that we will not have tutorials, but I'm still tossing up whether to include them or not. And as when I make a decision, I will let you know. And that's the admin that I have. I don't want to spend too much time on admin if I possibly can avoid it, but are there any admin questions before we get stuck into actual content? All good? Brilliant. In that case, let's talk about supply. So exactly as we talked about last week with demand, we do all the same stuff with supply, and I'll point out and I'll really emphasize the differences between the two, because there are differences, but there's lots of similarities. The first one is in terms of notation or nomenclature, which is that supply is a relationship. Much as demand is, supply is a relationship now between price and quantity of goods supplied or quantity supplied. So again, it doesn't make sense to say that the supply is 5 units The quantity supplied is 5 units. Supply is the relationship that says at this price, this is the quantity we supply. Or given this quantity supplied, this is the price we can charge. So quantity supplied is the maximum amount of good that the market is willing, or ultimately, quantity supplied is the maximum amount of the good that the market is willing and able to supply at a given price. Again, it's exactly the same as demand. And we typically put this down as a supply curve. So again, we do a graph, quantity versus price. We'll see these on the next slide, quantity versus price, and we talk about the supply curve. So where demand was talking about the benefit to consumers, right, the demand curve ended up, as we talked about, being derived from the benefit to consumers. The supply curve, or the supply relationship, is related instead to cost of production. So it's not about benefit, it's about cost. So it's the willingness of firms to provide goods at a given price. Really deeply baked into this, and we'll break this in week 6, but pretty deeply baked into all of this work, all your standard demand-supply analysis, is the assumption that firms, as well as consumers, firms are also price takers, which is to say, if I'm a firm, I don't get to decide what price I charge. There's a market price, and I have to charge that market price. We'll talk about this much more in week 5, and we'll break this down a little bit in week 6. But basically, our standard assumption in all of our standard demand and supply analysis has firms that are price takers, which is they go to the market. I produce apples. I can sell apples at $4 a kilo to the, well, that's too much. I can sell apples at $1 a kilo to my wholesaler, right? And that's the price I get. I get $1 a kilo from the wholesaler. I could sell apples for less than that, but I have no incentive to, because selling apples for less money than $1 a kilo is just less money for me. And I can't sell any apples for more than that, because if I try and sell apples for $1.01, then the other person, the apple farmer down the road, will just sell all of their apples for $1. So we have firms that are price takers in that they can sell as much as they want to at the market price, and they can't sell any amount for any amount more than the market price. They have no pricing power or market power. By contrast to law of demand is downward sloping. Law of supply isn't a thing, right? There is no such thing as a law of supply. Typically, supply will be upward sloping in most of our examples and in most of our work, but that's not required in any sense, right? Occasionally, supply might be downward sloping. This can happen in the real world, certainly. Okay. For all of our work, as with demand, we're going to talk about linear supply. So we're going to just do everything linear in all of our examples just to keep things easy. So supply is linear. When a dollar change in price means that the quantity supplied typically increases but changes by the same amount. So whether the price that I can get for my good goes from $2 to $3, right, or whether it goes from $10 to $11, the change in amount that I can supply is still the same, right? $2 to $3 is the same as $10 to $11. And as before, we can talk about these in tables, equations, graphs. We can talk about tables to give this nice supply schedule. Right, at this price, this is the amount of bananas. So I'm a banana producer. This is the amount of bananas that I choose to produce, right? 800 kilograms. At $5, right, the price is lower. I'm not going to produce as many for various reasons we'll talk about, but I'm going to produce fewer bananas. I'm going to only produce 600 kilograms of bananas because there's a lower price here, and similarly down the line. You can do this in a table. The tables are often useful, but for most of our analysis, we're going to be typically using graphs, and we can see that the same information is in both of these pieces of visualization, right? $6, 800, $6, 800, $5, 600, $5, 600, and so on. And we can do this as well in an equation. In most of our analysis, we're going to use graphs. In most qualitative analysis, economists do use the graphs. In most quantitative work or proper theory work, you use equations much more often. But all of these things are equivalent. Take questions in a bit. Okay, as before, we talk about, because we have linear supply, I'm doing this relatively quickly because it's the same as demand, right? Most of these things are very similar to demand. So we talk about the linear supply equation. Price is a linear equation or a linear transformation of quantity supplied. We can write it in this alternative form where we talk about quantity supplied as a function of price. That obviously should be a plus, not a minus. I do apologize. Right, that should be a plus, right? Yeah. That should be a plus, not a minus. I'll fix that and post new slides. This minus should be a plus. It's just transformation, changing the equation here. We now need to talk about the interpretations of these are now slightly different. This value A that I've written here, as before, A is still quantity, price, supply. As before, A is still this value here, right? It's still the y-intercept, mathematically, but our interpretation is very different. For demand, that y-intercept was the size of the market. Here it's not. Here we don't want to think of A being the size of the market. Here A is the minimum price required for the market to exist, right? If the price is below A, then no one wants to produce any of the good, right? So there is no market. There's no entry, there's no market, there's nothing. So if the price is below A, so A we want to think of as the minimum price for this market to actually exist, because it's this intercept here. When the price is below A, then no one produces anything, the market doesn't exist. M, much as before, is our sensitivity of quantity supplied to changes in price. And much like demand, linear supply is characterized entirely by these two parameters, this minimum price required to induce entry, minimum price required for the market to exist, and the sensitivity. The text talks a lot about elasticity of supply, and we will, hopefully, possibly today, we will possibly talk about that today. If we don't talk about it today, it will be covered either next week or in a supplementary lecture, but it will be covered. Okay, any questions at this time? Questions, concerns, problems? Yes. This formula is correct. This one needs a plus. I think it just needs a plus. Oh yeah, the equation, they should be the same equation. They're supposed to be the same equation. All I need is a plus here, I think. Oh, okay, sure. I'll have, okay. I'll need to fix this equation. This equation is not right. It's supposed to be this equation. Since I've cocked it up massively, so we want P equals A plus MQ. I want to get Q, so I get P minus A is MQ. It's easier just to do it. So yes, you're right. It is supposed to be minus, but these are supposed to be the other way around. So this is the correct equation, and I will fix this in the slides and post new slides. Otherwise, questions? Lovely. So, as with demand, we can talk about what kinds of things are going to cause changes in the quantity supplied. And just like demand, we have two distinct mechanisms by which we can talk about changes in quantity supplied. We can talk about changes due to changes in price, right? At different price levels, we have different quantities supplied. At this price level, at this low price level here, we sell this quantity, it's associated with the low price level. At this high price level, we want to supply this high amount of quantity supplied. So changes in price clearly are going to cause changes in quantity supplied. Similarly, and same as demand, and for the same reason as demand, changes in the supply schedule or supply relationship can also cause changes in quantity supplied. Right? If we just shift the supply curve around, then obviously at the same price we're still going to supply a different amount. If for some reason, that is to say, if for some reason quantity supplied changes and moves to S1, then even at the same price we still supply a different amount. Even at this original low price, we now supply a medium amount of goods because the supply curve has shifted. So type 1, our shifts along the supply curve, right, from one point of the supply curve to a different point on the same supply curve. Type 2 are shifts of the supply curve. We actually change supply curve. As before, shifts along, nice and easy. We just look at the supply curve. Shifts of the supply curve are a bit harder. So let's go through our examples. Similar examples to last time, we can talk about the food market in Canberra. I want to focus on markets rather than firms at this time, but it's much the same. So the food market in Canberra, so again, we're talking about mid-range food products. These places have relatively limited cooking space. So now, sorry, I should say as well, when we're now thinking about supply, the key features that we're worried about are quite different, right? We're not thinking about how good the product is. We're not thinking about how much people like the product or how many people there are that like the product. We're thinking about basically how much the product costs to produce and how difficult it is to produce the product. Because supply is a question of cost. Supply is a question of cost, not of benefit in any sense. So when we think about the food market in Canberra, our key features are quite different now than they were last week. Our key features are now cost features. Right, so we talk about this as a mid-range food product. That's going to affect its cost of production. We talk about the fact they have limited cooking space, right? They're quite small shops typically, with quite small kitchens. And that's going to affect the cost of production. We have that these people are renting from the university, which makes life very different than if they're renting privately. So we talk about the fact that they have the university admin sort of looking over what's going on. And so we can ask our standard questions. We can ask our questions of how steep the supply curve is. We can ask our questions of what's going to cause a change in this minimum price to induce entry. So what's going to cause what's going to cause shifts of the supply curve or changes in the steepness of the supply curve. You guys might be able to help me out. What might cause changes, quantity, price. What might cause changes in the supply curve, shifts of the supply curve? Focus on the second question here, shifts left and right of the supply curve, or up and down if you prefer. Rent? Yep, perfect. Rent is going to be, within different ways of talking about this, fairly important. This is related to our university administration overseers, right? If they change the rent, well then it changes the cost of producing the good. You need to be a little bit careful talking about rent because rent might be a fixed cost, which is a bit different, but certainly in the medium term, rent is going to be an important part of this. So rent's a little bit tricky because it might be a fixed cost, which we'll talk about in a bit, but certainly in the medium term, rent's going to work out well for us. What else might shift the supply curve? So many. Yep. Cost of raw material? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, cost of raw material, exactly, right. If wholesale food is cheap, well then the cost of production goes down. If wholesale food is expensive, then the cost of production goes up because we're a food market. Most goods and services have inputs, but not all. What were some of the things that were said just then? Or anyone, other ideas? Wages, yeah. And wages are going to be important, especially at the uni, because I don't actually know if this is true or not. Does anyone know if working at the food market in Canberra is covered under the university award wage or if it's private? I don't actually know. Does anyone know? No, okay. Because typically the university award wage is quite a lot higher than private wages. And so the university component of this could be quite important. But I suspect that these people are probably just strictly private. But certainly wages is going to be an important component, as it always is of cost. Not necessarily of the food, not specifically of the food market in Canberra, but of everything that you produce. Wages are going to be obviously an important component of costs. Anything else? These are our main ones. Tax. I'm not going to include tax. It's a good answer. It's typically correct. But I'm going to treat tax differently. We'll talk about tax next week, and I'm going to treat tax differently, and I'm not going to have government taxation as a cost of production. I'm going to work with it differently because it's much more convenient and much nicer to work with as a different kind of object rather than strictly as a cost of production, as we'll see next week. One more, sorry? Interest rate, yeah, sure, I can work with that. Typically these things are, it's not something I normally include, but yeah, I can work with that. For most of these places, they're going to have borrowed money, and so changes in interest rates are going to cause changes. I'm happy with that. Not something I typically think about, but that's okay. I think we have enough. Yes, there's a couple that we didn't include that I will include now that are going to cause changes in our supply curve. So technology is going to be a big part of this. Typically, not so much in the food market in Canberra, so it wasn't surprising we missed it, but technology is going to be really important. The idea being that improvements in technology reduce costs. This is in some sense why we like technology. So the suggestion was seasonality. In some cases, yes, so some types of production there will be seasonality. For somewhere like Canberra, I suspect there probably isn't much seasonality for food market in Canberra because the seasonality is going to be in demand. There's going to be in Canberra, huge amount of seasonality in demand. During semester, massive demand. Out of semester, virtually zero demand. But that's entirely a demand question, right? The seasonality here in Canberra is going to be almost exclusively a demand question. It's really not going to affect the cost of production in a noticeable way. And so it's not going to affect the supply curve in a significant way. It will affect it a little bit because of things like wages. There's less people around, so wages might be harder to come. Like maybe you may have to pay higher wages to get people to work, but I think you probably don't really. So there may be some seasonality in Canberra, but I suspect there isn't much. Certainly in lots of industries there will be seasonality in terms of cost of production. Lots of raw food materials, there's going to be high seasonality, right? The cost of producing an apple in apple picking season is quite low relative to the cost of producing an apple outside of apple picking season, right? Because outside of apple picking season you have to create an apple in winter. I don't actually know when apples come forth. To create a fresh apple in winter is going to be expensive and difficult. To create a fresh apple in autumn, I think they come in autumn, is going to be relatively straightforward. Again, I'm making up the seasons because I don't know that much about apple growing. But the principle holds. Does that answer your concern? Lovely. So technology, super important, and is going to change our supply curve a lot. Again, typically we want to think of improvements in technology causing reductions in cost. The price of inputs, right? We talked about raw materials, so we got to price of inputs. Going to make a huge difference. Wages as well. So raw materials and wages, to a lesser extent the interest rate, we're thinking of as the price of inputs. Government regulations are going to make a big difference. This is what I wanted to talk about with the university administration. So government regulations or regulations from people higher up, these are going to potentially make a big difference in the cost of production. So if the government says, you have to do this and this and this and this and this in addition to all of your normal production costs, so government introduces red tape, if you like, this is going to push up cost of production. That's not to say it's necessarily a bad thing, but one effect of government regulation will typically be increasing cost of production. We will not include taxes and subsidies in this framework, because we will treat taxes and subsidies differently, and we'll talk about them next week. Because it's much more convenient to talk about taxes and subsidies. It's much more enlightening to talk about them as a separate kind of object, rather than as a cost of production. The textbook does include them as a cost of production. We will not, but I'll talk about this again a lot more next week. The number of firms in the market is going to make a big difference. Because this is a market level, each individual firm, this is not going to affect the A, but it is going to affect the supply curve. And we'll talk more about this in a moment. But as we have more firms, right, more firms means we can produce at the same price, we're going to produce more. Right? If I just throw more firms in, right, this is if I have two firms, where's my green pen? If I have two firms, then at this price of $3, they produce this many, right? They produce 6 goods. If I have a third firm, this is with 2 firms. If I have 3 firms, right, then the first firm produces 3 units, the second firm produces 3 units, and the third firm also produces 3 units. So with 3 firms, typically I would produce more. Because if my firms are all the same, but I just have more of them, then they're going to produce more. So typically, as we have more firms, we're going to see this kind of shift of the supply curve. Because each firm produces the same amount, but there's just more firms. So these are typical things that happen. We'll talk more about adding up firms in a moment. Questions, queries, concerns? Yes? No. The question was, it's a good question, and the question was, will a change in the demand relationship affect the supply relationship? And the answer is no. Right? These are in some ways, one of the really, the answer is typically no. One of the really nice features of the demand-supply model is that we can almost entirely split apart the market. We can entirely talk about these are the demand side of the market, this is the supply side of the market. And they interact in terms of, as we'll see in a moment, in terms of forming prices and quantities actually sold in equilibrium, but shifts of the demand curve don't affect the supply curve. We can build a supply curve without talking about the demand curve. The position of the demand curve doesn't affect the supply curve in any way. They're separate objects in every respect. They're part of the same model, but you can have a demand curve and you can talk about shifts of the demand curve, or you can talk about things that happen that shift the demand curve that have no effect on supply, things that affect things that will shift the supply curve that will have no effect on demand. Most shocks to our market will affect either demand or supply, but not both. Most shocks. Not all shocks, but most of them. But no, they're entirely separate objects. As we've been seeing, right, I didn't talk at all yesterday or at all last week about supply. I haven't spoken at all this week so far about demand, but I can still draw the supply curve. I can still talk about the supply curve without talking about demand. I can talk about demand without talking about supply. Does that address your concern? Yep. Ultimately, we'll talk about that in a moment, but yes, so they're both facing the same price. This is why they're both supply and demand will end up sitting within the same market, in that they'll both have the same price, right? In that the price consumers face will also be the price that sellers receive. But the demand relationship doesn't depend on the supply relationship. The demand relationship is purely about marginal benefit. The supply relationship, as we'll see in a bit, is purely about marginal cost. And they're not related. Yep, I'll grab some first, yep.
Are you assuming that
There's vague background assumptions of what I've talked about today, which is that firms are perfectly competitive. But we'll talk a lot more about competition in week 5 and 6. Week 5 is perfect competition, week 6 is imperfect competition. So the question is, why am I pivoting around this point, basically, as I increase number of firms? If firms are all identical, right, if firms are identical, then you will get this kind of pivot behavior as you introduce more firms, because when I have 2 firms, or let's say when I have 1 firm, if when I have 1 firm at a price of $1, I want to produce nothing, then the second firm also at a price of $1 wants to produce nothing. The third firm at a price of $1 also wants to produce nothing, right? Every firm, because they're all the same, at a price of $1, they choose to produce nothing. This is assuming that all firms are the same. And that's not always the case, as we'll see in a moment. Questions, concerns? Okay. Let's talk quickly about, again, our marijuana market, because it's always nice to talk about unusual markets. So again, key features: recreational drug, illegal to supply. And this is our distinction between demand and supply. Some things will affect demand and supply. Things like the fact that it's a recreational drug are probably going to affect both demand and supply. Things like the fact that it's illegal to supply or illegal to produce is going to affect both. Well, the fact that it's illegal to produce is going to affect supply. The fact that it's illegal to consume is going to affect demand. right? So the illegality is going to affect both, but for different reasons. The fact that it's addictive has nothing to do with supply. The fact that it's addictive or dependency properties has nothing to do with supply. The quality of the product has nothing to do with supply. The fact that it can be produced by small producers has nothing to do with demand. Right? These are separate objects. Right? And the fact that it can be produced by small producers may have some effect on cost. Maybe it doesn't. But we can think about the kinds of things that might shift, that might affect the supply curve for marijuana. Does anyone want to hazard, say some stuff that they think might affect the cost structure or the marginal cost or the supply curve for marijuana production? Any takers? Just one back over here, sorry. What was it? The rate of what? The rain, the climate. Right, there's a reason that they don't produce marijuana in Iraq. It's because the cost of production is very high. They produce other things in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's because the climate is not good for it, so they produce other drugs when they're trying to produce drugs. There's a reason it's not, and so in any case, climate's obviously going to have an effect on the cost of production. If you're in a place with the appropriate climate, relatively cheap, inappropriate climate, relatively expensive. Any other effects? There was one here. Okay, sure. Yeah. So same idea. Any other takers? Pardon? Yep. Legality. It's a lot harder to grow in the US than it is in Canada, because it's legal in Canada. It's not legal in the US, so legality is going to make a big difference. I think technology is going to make a big difference here. Because you can either grow outside, where climate makes a big difference, or you can grow inside, where the level of technology you have access to makes a big difference. Technology is a really broad-ranging term in economics. Technology doesn't mean how fast your computer is. Right? Technology includes things like the quality of your fertilizer, or the quality of your lights, or the quality of your processes in particular as well. So the process by which you do things. So if you have a really good process for producing marijuana, we would talk about you having a good technology. When I say process, I mean, process. So if you know how to do it better, it's going to be cheaper, and the difference there is technology. Any other takers? Otherwise, I'll just continue. Yep. Logistics? Sure. I think it's going to tie in quite a lot with legality, but yes, logistic costs are going to be very important. And particularly for something like an illegal drug, because the logistic costs are going to typically be much higher, because it's difficult to transport this easily. So I like that answer. That's a good one. Questions, concerns? Otherwise, any other things I should add? Lovely. So we can talk about different things that are going to affect costs. You'll notice as well that most of these things will also affect our Cambry market, but they will be more important in the marijuana market than in the Cambry food market. And that's pretty standard, right? We think about when we want to model, if we're wanting to model the marijuana market, cost of logistics, or in particular legality, is going to be really important. If we're wanting to model the Cambry food market, we're not going to include legality as one of our things that we want to include in our model, because it's kind of assumed that it's legal already, right? We don't have to worry about that. Okay. Differences between supply and demand, because so far really I've talked about them being the same thing basically. Major differences: supply typically or usually slopes upwards. Demand is almost always downward sloping. As you will have seen in your tutorials, you've not all had tutes, have you? As you've either seen or will see in your tutorials, even demand is not always downward sloping, but demand is almost always downward sloping, whereas supply only usually is upward sloping. Supply is much more likely than demand to have extreme behavior. And when I say extreme behavior, I mean being either being infinitely sensitive to price, which is you have a quantity, you have a price. It's not that uncommon for supply to be infinitely sensitive to price, which basically says infinitely sensitive this way, which is this kind of supply curve here, right? This kind of supply curve where any change in quantity causes an infinitely large change in price, so a totally horizontal supply curve, is not that uncommon. And when we talk in week 5 about perfectly competitive markets, in perfectly competitive markets, assuming there's no industry-wide gains to scale, we do see perfectly flat supply curves. Right? This is the standard thing we see in perfectly competitive markets. This is we can produce as much as we like at this price, and that's it. Right? At this price, we will produce as much as is required at this price. Similarly, we can talk about total insensitivity to price. So that is where we talk about this kind of behavior here, where the quantity doesn't change. The quantity is totally independent of price. Right? It doesn't matter what the price is. There's a fixed amount that we can supply, and we'll supply exactly that amount, totally regardless of the price. And so the standard example for S prime is something like waterfront land. Right? We think about waterfront land. There's a fixed amount of it. We can't produce more waterfront land in somewhere like Sydney, say. We can't produce more waterfront land. Right? There's an amount that exists. And whatever the price is, that's the amount that exists of waterfront land. Nothing that we do will make more of it. Nothing that we, regardless of the price, if the price goes to $1 million per block, and the price is currently much more than $1 million per block, there's the same amount of land as if the price is $10 million per block, or if the price is $1 per block, right? It's still the fixed amount of land. So we can have supply that is also totally insensitive to price. Price doesn't matter at all. Under certain specialized circumstances, supply may slope downwards. We'll see some of those in week 5. And you guys, I've already done one of these now. I've done S prime is a good that is totally insensitive. Can anyone think of a kind of good that might be infinitely sensitive to price? Which is to say, this S here. There we go. This S here. Totally flat supply. So once we hit that price, we'll produce as much as we like at that fixed price. Any takers? Electricity? Possibly. I suspect, certainly at the market, certainly in the medium term, that's not going to be the case, right? If the price goes higher, we can produce more. We can build new power. We can build new solar panels. There's actions. Sorry. As the price goes down, we will produce typically less power. I guess, yeah, sure. I can work with this. So we can talk about solar power in the short term. Right, in the short term, when we can't put more solar panels online, it doesn't really matter what the price. This is the other way around. This is S prime. Solar power in the short term, it doesn't really matter what the price is. There's an amount of power that we produce, and we produce that amount of power. So this is really more S prime. This is fixed quantity, and the price doesn't really matter. Right? So I have solar panels on my roof at home. If the price tomorrow of energy that I can feed back into the grid spikes to $100 million per watt, I can't do anything about that, right? I can't suddenly produce more power because of this, right? If the price drops to 0, I don't produce less power because the price is lower. I have a fixed amount of product that I produce. So this is more like our total insensitivity to price, which are more common. Yep. So certainly that's sold. So the session was fixed, like unlimited download on a fixed, unlimited download on broadband for a fixed amount of money per month. That's going to be a little bit fiddly because there is still a cost of production that's going on in the background. What we face as consumers, the package that we buy as consumers is going to be different than the production costs for the actual firm. So that's more about bundling in certain ways rather than the actual costs of production. But typically, I like the idea behind for S. I like the idea behind lots of software type stuff. For lots of software is going to be our standard idea of this, because you know what? If I'm producing software, it's a matter of whether the marginal cost is, if it costs me 2 cents to send out from myself. I've made a piece of software and I'm trying to sell it. It costs me 2 cents to produce each unit, and so I'm willing to sell, assuming I have no market power, which I would typically. But if I have no market power, then as long as the price is at least 2 cents, I'm willing to sell as many as I like for that price, right? It doesn't cost me anything extra apart from that 2 cents. It's not like the price increases over time. The marginal cost increases over time. So lots of software, particularly, is going to have this kind of flat marginal cost, this flat supply curve structure. And indeed, anything to do with, as we'll talk about later, anything to do with natural monopolies. Right? If you're a water company, if you're the company that produces water for Canberra, your marginal cost curve is pretty flat. If I think of this as a marginal cost curve, your marginal cost curve is pretty much flat to produce the variable cost to produce the first litre of water, or rather the cost to produce the second litre of water, is the same as the cost to produce the 100,000th litre of water. And so you get a pretty flat marginal cost curve. Though supply is a little bit more of a tricky thing to talk about. Any questions, though? We have supply curves. They're typically downward sloping, but sometimes aren't. That's the key. Questions, concerns? Okay, so let's talk a little bit let's delve a little bit more deeply into what makes the supply curve. So we talk about firms. When we're talking about producers, we're typically talking about firms. And so I want to talk about what firms are, why they exist, very briefly. So a firm is some organization which produces goods or services for sale. That's really our general idea of a firm. The university is a firm, Sushi Smith is a firm, an individual producer of marijuana is a firm, an individual seller of marijuana is a firm. So firms typically consist of lots of different objects that are sort of smashed together. We have workers, managers, owners, other types of workers in our firm. Capital is going to be a component of our firm typically. However, we kind of ignore all of that, and we tend to treat firms as single objects. If you go into the industrial organization literature, and if you talk about industrial organization, or talk about, say, business, I believe does this as well, then they break down firms and they really worry about how the firm works specifically. But in economics, in general economic theory, we basically say this is a firm, it is a single entity that behaves as a single entity and does things. We don't worry too much about the individual components within a firm. So we talk about the reason why we think firms exist. The main thing here is to minimize transaction costs, right? If the university it's a lot cheaper for the university to hire me to do a sequence of lectures, to hire me as a staff member, and then I just do lectures that I'm told, than it is to hire me for every single lecture individually, to write every single assessment individually, to mark every single piece of marking that I do. It's a lot easier to just say, we're going to hire you, and then you're going to do what you're told. Because it minimizes transaction costs. We don't have the negotiation phase every single time they want me to do a lecture. They just hire you, and you do what you're told. So a big part of why we think firms exist is to minimize these transaction costs, to minimize those negotiation costs. A big part of why these things exist is to, again, in the same sort of vein, is to avoid having new contracts for every single project. If you're working at a shop, it's a lot easier, the university is a bit better example for this. If you're working at the university, it's a lot easier to have someone who's full-time staff who you give a project to, rather than having to find a new person every single time. Even if you're finding the same person every time to start a new project, it's typically cheaper or easier to have someone who's just on staff. It's also, and this is a key one that's a little bit trickier, that's not part of the standard sort of first-year master's curriculum, which is that it's really difficult to write complete contracts. So a complete contract would be a complete description of everything that your job entails, of every single little component of your job, and they're really hard to write, right? Typically they're impossible to write, and so we don't even try. So if you look at almost all contracts are incomplete, what we call incomplete contracts, which are, we're going to hire you, and you're going to do this and this and this and this, and you're going to do anything else that looks vaguely reasonable, right? It's going to be included as well. So when you go and you work for a dodgy fast food joint, yes, you have to produce the food, yes, you have to handle the money, and also you have to clean up when someone spills a drink, and also you have to clean the machines, and also you have to do X, Y. But we don't say all those things, we just say you have to do items 1, 2, and 3, and also other things as they come up. That's typically what contracts look like, and without firms, without objects that bring together workers, you can't really do that. You can't require that people do the last part, and other things as they come up, part of the equation, which is very important. So this is why we think this is what firms are, this is why we think firms exist, or why we think firms are helpful. For now, firms are exclusively going to be price takers. So firms are price takers, they go into the market and face a price, and they choose how much to produce in order to try to maximize profit. This looks a lot like our consumers, who are price takers, who are trying to maximize net benefit, to try to maximize consumer surplus. Here our firms are price takers, they want to maximize profit. So let's talk about profit and marginal profit. So, firms produce good, questions, concerns, problems? Yes?
Just an observation for the existence of firms.
Yep.
Noted on the explanation on saying that it requires investigation, it requires revision, because it's like minimizing transaction costs, avoiding costs. In reality, it's
I can't comment. These are really, these are general statements, standard economic statements for why we think firms exist. They're very high-level statements on why firms exist. But they're intended as high-level statements. In practice, when you're making a firm, you're not going to make a firm in order to minimize transaction costs. But from an economic perspective, the question of we're going to make firms to make money, basically, typically. But from an economic perspective, the reasons why, if we're designing an economy, we think firms are a good thing to have as a concept is because of these reasons. The standard arguments are because of these reasons as to why firms are a good thing to have in an economy. In the same way that we don't have consumer collectives, right? We have producer collectives, which are firms. We don't have consumer collectives because these things don't really matter for consumer collectives, for what would be consumer collectives. But I can talk more about it afterwards if you'd prefer. Otherwise, concerns, questions? Okay, so profit and marginal profit. So firms produce goods and services not because they like production, not because they gain some, warm and fuzzy. So for demand, people demanded stuff, people consumed stuff because it gave them warm and fuzzies, right? Because they gained utility by consumption, directly from consumption. Firms do not produce because they gain direct utility from production, right? It's different for firms, as you would expect, right? Firms produce goods or services for sale because by selling them, they can produce profit, right? By selling, they produce revenue and profit, and they want profit. And so profit is total revenue minus total costs, in the same way as you'd expect. So total revenue is just the amount of money that comes in, total cost is the amount of cost of production to make the good. The marginal profit, as we did for consumers, we talked about marginal benefit. For producers, we talk about marginal profit. So the marginal profit of the nth good is the extra profit we gain producing and selling the nth good compared to producing and selling only n-1 goods. So it's that difference in profit, that extra profit we get from the nth good. And as I say, our firm is wanting to maximize profit, and so we can talk about how they go about maximizing profit. So I want to break down cost a little bit. Total revenue is actually really straightforward. Total revenue is just, price times quantity sold. But cost is a little bit tricky. This total cost component, that's a little bit fiddly. So total cost has we divide total cost typically into two components, our fixed cost and our variable cost. So we typically divide total cost into fixed cost and variable cost. Don't say that. Total cost is fixed cost and variable cost, typically. The difference here being that fixed costs do not change as we produce more product. Right? The standard example is building the factory. Right? Once we have it costs a lot to make the factory, but once we have the factory, we have it. Right? The cost doesn't change whether the factory produces 10 units or whether it produces 10,000 units. Variable costs are those that do change as production increases. So most of our inputs, right, if we produce 10 units, then we pay the input cost for 10 units. If we produce 10,000 units, we pay much more in terms of input costs. In terms of labor, is going to be a big part of this, but also raw material input costs for most goods. Marginal costs, right? Marginal cost, remember, is the change in cost. So I say marginal profit here. Marginal costs are the change in costs as we change level of production. So marginal cost is going to be exclusively dependent on variable cost, right? Because the fixed cost doesn't change, right? Whether I produce 1,000 units or 1,001 units, fixed cost is the same. And so fixed cost isn't going to affect marginal cost in any way. And we'll see this through an example, but fixed costs are going to be exclusively talking about marginal costs are a function of variable cost, are the change in variable cost. And we'll see an example. Why do I go this far before I see an example? I'll do this example now. I'll fiddle things around a little bit. So we can talk about the fixed cost, the variable cost, the marginal cost of producing tons of apples per week. And we talk about 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 tons of apples. We can talk about the total cost of production. Here we have a fixed cost of $5,000. Right, it's a $5,000 fixed cost. And that doesn't matter how much we produce. To produce 0 tons of apples, we still have to spend the $5,000. Right? Because that's the cost that we spend every week, regardless, every period, regardless of the amount we actually produce. But then we have variable costs. Here we have variable costs that are, variable costs are increasing, as you'd expect. We also have marginal costs, and so we can talk about the marginal cost being the change in, definitionally, the change in total cost. So if I look at marginal cost, to produce 0 tons of apples cost $5, to produce 1 ton of apples cost $8, so the marginal cost is the difference, which is $3. To produce the second ton of apples costs $12. Do you notice that's $4 higher? So the second ton of apples cost $4,000 to produce, that second ton of apples. The third ton of apples cost difference here, which is $5,000. The point I want to get at is that the marginal cost, while definitionally it's from the total cost, in practice, we get it from variable cost. Typically, in practice, we get it from variable cost. Because, right, the marginal cost is $3, it's also this difference here. $4 is also the difference here. $5 is also the difference here. So the differences are all the same. If I wanted to do a tiny bit of mathematics, which I try and avoid when I can, marginal cost is the change in total cost. This symbol here means change in, is the change in total cost, which is the change in fixed cost plus the change in variable cost. But fixed costs are fixed, and so there is no change in fixed costs. So the marginal cost is just the change in variable costs. This is just the mathematics of the words I've been trying to say. Questions, concerns? Marginal cost. Excellent. Marginal costs. So So we are mostly concerned with firms in the short run, at least today, with firms in the what we call the short run. So we divide time typically into short run and long run. Short run is when you can change some things, long run is when you can change everything. So in the short run, the firm can change some, but not all of its inputs. Generally, we think about firms being able to change how much labor they use, but not how much capital they have. If we're thinking, again, in the university context, you can hire more lecturers in the short run, you can hire more tutors, you can run more classes in the short run, but you can't build more classrooms in the short run. You can't build more lecture theatres in the short run. Right? That's a longer-term question. If we're thinking about owning a factory, we can hire more workers in the short run. We can't build more factories in the short run. And then we have the key point here, which is that we talk about diminishing marginal product of labour. So the reason why we think that marginal cost increases as we try and produce more is usually that we have diminishing marginal product of labour, which means that the first person you hire to do a job is really good at that job, right? Because you hire the best person you can. The second person you hire for this job is not so good at the job. They're still really good, but they're not as good as the first person. Because you hired the best person first, that means the best person's already hired. The most productive person, you've already hired them. You can't hire them again. So for the second person, you have to hire the second best person. When you hire the third person, you have to hire the third best person. And so what you end up with is that the first couple of units to produce, they're being produced by the most productive, most efficient person. And so they're really cheap to produce. So you have really low marginal cost. Right? Nope. These first few units, these are produced by the most productive, best person that we have. And so they're pretty cheap to produce. Let's say quite a lot. Then we have to hire our second person. Our second person's still good, but they're not as good. And so it costs more to produce those next few units. Next person is not as good. The third person, again, not as good, not as good, not as good. And so we're getting increasing marginal costs over time. One argument for that is diminishing marginal product of labour. You hire the best person first, because of course you hire the best person first. But that means you've already hired, that when you go to hire a second person, you've already got the best person, so you have to get the second best person. The other main argument for increasing marginal cost, for upward sloping marginal cost, is a land-based argument, which is if I'm an apple producer and I'm growing apples, right, the first ton of apples I grow on my best possible land, my most productive, best land. So it's really cheap and easy. The second ton of apples I grow on my less good land. Right, I grow on my second best plot of land. So it's more expensive. Not super expensive, but more expensive to grow that second ton of apples, and so on as we get more, as we increase the amount of production. Okay, I'm going to push through a tiny bit. Components of marginal profit. So we talk about marginal profit, which is our change in profit as we sell an extra good. We get two components. We get marginal revenue, marginal cost. As I talk about, marginal revenue is super easy, because marginal revenue, the extra revenue I get, is just the price. Right? Because I'm a price taker, I can sell as many goods. I go into the market, I'm selling apples to my wholesaler buys as many apples as I can sell them for $1 per kilo. And they'll buy as many apples as I can sell them at $1 per kilo. So if I want to sell an extra unit, I just make an extra $1. So marginal revenue is just the price of the good. Marginal cost is the change in total cost due to producing the good or service. It's the difference in cost. It's going to typically vary. It's going to typically be upward sloping, but it's going to vary between different amounts of production for the reasons I just talked about. As an annoyance, which is different than the demand case. In the demand case, total benefit was just the sum of the marginal benefits. Here, total cost is typically, or is not, just the sum of marginal costs. It is an annoyance, but it is true. Total cost is not sum of marginal costs. What is the sum of marginal cost is variable costs. This is why I talked about variable costs. So variable cost is just the sum of marginal costs, as we see in our example. right? This 12 here is 3 plus 4 plus 5 is 12. Right? The sum of marginal costs is the variable cost. The sum of marginal costs is not the total cost, because we have this fixed cost component floating around, which we didn't have in the demand case. Yes. Questions on that point first? Questions, concerns, issues on that point? Okay. I think we're just about done. Yes, sure. So, we as firms are looking to maximize profit. So, price is fixed, we face the price, whatever it is. We want to know the level of production which maximizes profit. Fixed, and this is going to be a little bit tricky, since fixed costs don't change, they're totally irrelevant for knowing the level of production which maximizes profit. This is a little bit tricky. Fixed costs are going to affect the amount of profit that we make in a significant way. Fixed costs are going to affect whether our profit, therefore, is positive or negative, so that whether our firm can be profitable at all. But fixed costs do not affect the amount of production that we actually choose to make. Right? Assuming we make some, fixed costs are not going to have any effect on the amount of production which maximizes profit. Again, I'm in a factory. I'm looking at starting a firm, building a factory, producing widgets. Widgets are the standard thing that things produce in economic theory. If I'm building a factory, I'm looking to produce widgets. I have a variable cost function for my widgets, and I have a big pile of total costs, but I have a big pile of fixed costs to build the factory. Whether the factory costs $10 million or $20 million is going to be very, very important for how much profit I make, obviously. It's going to be very, very important for whether I want to open the factory at all. But if I'm going to open the factory, whether the factory costs $10 million or $20 million doesn't affect at all how much I'm going to produce once the factory is open. We can talk about sunk costs to a certain extent, but it's not going to affect how much I produce once the factory is open, once I've built the factory. Because once I've built the factory, the fixed costs are done. Because they don't change, they're not relevant for knowing the level of production which maximizes profit. We said all that. To emphasize, we care about the level where we as economists, we don't really care about level of profit. Right? I don't really care whether your firm makes $10 million or $20 million per year. It doesn't really bother me. I care about how much your firm produces. So I'm all about efficient production, not about actual amount of profit. So we care about the level of production which maximizes profits, because that's the level of production you're going to make. But we don't care about the actual level of profit, typically. So we care about variable marginal costs. We don't care so much about total costs. We care a little bit about total costs, as we'll see in week 5, but not, week 5, but not that much about total costs. This is my rant about costs completed. Any questions? And then we'll dive into surplus. Any questions about costs? Concerns, problems? Okay. Surplus. So now we can talk then about producer surplus. So, when we sell each good, we accrue the marginal revenue of selling the good, obviously, right? That's our benefit. The reason we sell goods is to make that revenue. And that's just the price. Total revenue, sum of marginal revenues, right? As is always the case. Graphically, we can talk about total revenue. It's the area of the rectangle of height P0, in this instance, height P0 and length Q1, right? This is our total revenue. We face a price P0. We choose to sell Q1. And it's just the total revenue is the price we get times the quantity we sell. So it's P0 times Q1, which is this area here, which can be represented as this area here. So total revenue is just price that we get times quantity sold. So it's this box. Similarly, when we produce each good, it costs us the marginal cost of production for that good. And the variable cost is just the sum of all of our marginal costs. And so if we go to our graph, right, the price we get doesn't matter for costs. So we sell Q1, right? This first unit costs this much to produce, the second unit costs this much to produce, the third unit costs this much to produce, and so on. So this red region here is our variable cost. Not total cost, is our variable cost. So graphically, it's the area under the marginal cost curve, up to the amount actually produced. Producer surplus is then the difference between the total revenue and the variable cost. So we talk about producer surplus. It is different than profit. Good. It is different than profit. It's the gap, the difference between total revenue and variable cost. And in this instance, at a price P0 and quantity Q1, this is going to be our producer surplus. This should be ringing lots of similarity bells with the consumer surplus, right? It's very, very similar. Any questions? Questions, concerns? Lovely. So, producer surplus is the difference between total revenue and and variable cost of production. So, and this is where this is where you need to be a little bit fiddly, because firms want to maximize profit. They don't implicitly, by virtue of itself, want to maximize producer surplus. They want to maximize profit. But if they maximize producer surplus, then they maximize profit, right? The levels of producer surplus and profit will be different. But if you're maximizing producer surplus is the gap. Let's write this down. Producer surplus is revenue minus variable cost. Profit, we use pi for profit in economics. This is a pi for profit. Profit is revenue minus total cost. That means the difference between profit and producer surplus. Yep, no. Yeah. Is just the fixed cost. It might be minus the fixed cost, but it's just the fixed cost is the difference. So our difference between profit and producer surplus is just the fixed cost. Is related to fixed cost. And fixed costs don't matter for the level of production that maximizes profit. Right? Fixed costs don't matter for the level of production which maximizes profit. What that means is that our profit maximizing firm is also our producer surplus maximizing firm. Right? If I'm choosing quantity, revenue minus variable cost minus fixed cost. So if I do this minus this, there's actually a minus sign there. If I'm maximizing revenue minus variable cost, choosing the quantity that maximizes this, I'm also choosing the quantity that maximizes this, because the only difference between them is fixed cost, which doesn't affect maximizing levels. So our profit maximizing firm is also our producer surplus maximizing firm. So our rational firm wants to make producer surplus as large as they possibly can, and we can look graphically and see, as with demand, as with consumer surplus, producer surplus is maximized when the quantity supplied is given by this marginal cost curve. Right? Here I can do better. If I face a price P0, I can do better than Q1, because if I sell a little bit more, produce a little bit more than Q1, then I get this extra little sliver of producer surplus. If I sell a little bit more again, I get this extra sliver of producer surplus. So I can sell more and more, and I want to sell up until the level given by the marginal cost curve. That's going to maximize my producer surplus. That's going to give me revenue, it's going to give me variable costs, and it's going to maximize my producer surplus when quantity produced is given by this marginal cost curve. We can talk about overproduction, right? I should have done that. I did that way too quickly. I have a slide at the end here. Yes. Sorry, moving around a bit. We could talk about overproduction as well. This should say production at the top, not consumption. About overproduction. So if I face a price P0, I produce Q2, you'll notice that I do worse because this is my revenue, this is my variable cost as before, but now we have this nice area in green of producer surplus, but we lost this red area. So we did worse because we produced too much. Because all of these productions, all of this production out here, the cost of producing those units was higher than the benefit that I got, which was to say the amount that I could sell them for. So it cost me $10 to produce, I only sold them for $8, I became worse off. So profits maximize when producer surplus is maximized, and producer surplus is maximized when the quantity supplied is given by marginal cost curve. And it is for these reasons that we're allowed to say that the marginal cost curve and the supply curve are the same thing. Right? So the fact that marginal cost curve and supply curve is the same thing is a function of the fact that our firms are profit maximizing. Right? It's because our firms want to maximize profit that we end up with marginal cost and supply being the same thing. They're certainly not definitionally the same thing. And if you have firms that aren't trying to maximize profit, so non-profit firms, for example, that have other things they're trying to go for, then the marginal cost curve is going to be different than the supply curve, potentially. If you have firms that aren't price takers, as we'll see in week 6, firms that aren't price takers, then marginal cost and supply curves can be different. Right? This really relies, the idea of marginal cost curve and supply curve being the same relies on firms that are profit maximizing and firms that are price takers. And if you don't have those things, then marginal cost and supply can be different. Okay, any questions? Questions, problems, issues at this time? Same thing we did for demand. Okay, I'm not going to go through this. We talked a little bit about adding up firms, about having one firm or two firms or three firms before. I'll talk very, very quickly about adding up firms. So all of our discussion so far, in some ways, had a single firm or we sort of were thinking of this in terms of a single firm. But obviously, in any market, there's going to be many firms, and they may potentially have different cost structures. So we did do a quick example where we talked about identical firms, but maybe firms are different. And so we want to think about how to move from individual firms' marginal cost curves to the market supply curve, basically. Or individual firm supply curves to the market supply curve. And so we do this by adding up quantities, by adding up the quantity supplied. We do what we call horizontal summation, which is a very strange object. And so we can talk about, this is firm 1. Firm 1 has this supply curve. At a price of $2, they produce nothing. At a price of $4, they produce 2 tons of apples. At $6, they produce 4 tons of apples. This is the supply curve for firm 1. We have a supply curve for firm 2. At a price of $2, they produce nothing. At a price of $3, they produce nothing. At a price of $4, they produce 2 tons. At a price of $6, they produce 6 tons of apples. This is a firm with higher fixed costs, or higher price required to enter the market, not higher fixed cost, higher price required to enter the market, but then a flatter supply curve. Now, this is a firm, if we're thinking about this as apples, because we are, this is a firm where the best bit of land isn't as good, but all of the land that they have is much more similar. So we have a flatter supply curve that starts from a higher point. So this is our supply curve 1 and 2. And we can talk about the market supply curve, right? What does the market supply curve for apples look like? Well, at a price of $2, firm 1 produces nothing and firm 2 produces nothing. So the market supply curve is going to go through this point here. $2, no production. At a price of $3, firm 1 produces 1 ton and firm 2 produces no tons, and so it's going to be 1 ton of production. At a price of $4, firm 1 produces 2 tons and firm 2 also produces 2 tons, and so we're going to see a total production level of 4 tons of apples. We do horizontal summation. It's 2 plus 2 equals 4. Right? At $5, we see 3 plus 4, right, equals 7. And so we get this kind of object for the market level supply curve. Again, it's being driven by, to use this curve here, at a price of $4, this firm 1 produces 2 units, firm 2 produces 2 units, so the market produces 4 units. At a price of $6, firm 1 produces 4 units, firm 2 produces 6 units, so the market produces 10 units. And so we talk about this as horizontal summation. We're summing these in a horizontal manner. We're drawing, if you like, we draw S1, and we draw in a different color. we draw S1 plus S2. To do horizontal summation. It's not super important, but it's worth mentioning briefly. Questions, concerns? Lovely. Oh, yeah, and we will occasionally, typically, in most cases, I'll be asking you to do qualitative analysis, which is to say, does the producer surplus increase or decrease, by how much, what is the such and such. Sometimes you'll be asked to do this numerically, but rarely. I've included the slides, but you do need to be able to, say, well, at a price of $4, we choose to produce 2 units. We look at our graph and we find that the producer surplus is, what is that, 2 units, right? It's $2 worth of producer surplus on this graph, or $2,000, I think, technically. But it's 2 worth of producer surplus on this graph. So you need to be able to do this. If you are unable to do this, please do come to help desk or ask at the end of class today, or come to office hours. We have numerous things available, but you need to be able to find the area of this triangle. Right? This is a thing that we're going to require you to be able to do. Okay, this is all I have on producer surplus. I have more to say today, obviously. This is all I have on producer surplus, and on the producer side for today. Are there any questions at this time? This is a good time for questions about producers, production, supply curves. Yes. Yep. The prices for, so here we're assuming, so in this example, this is an example where this S1 is the supply curve, that we face a price of $4 per kilo. The market means I can sell my goods for $4, right? I want to maximize producer surplus. That means I produce according to this, that means I'm going to produce 2 units, 2 tons of apples. And so my producer surplus is going to be this region here, because, again, my total revenue is my total revenue is 4 times 2. My total costs are the area, or my variable cost anyway, are the area under my supply curve. And so the difference between those is this triangle here. So that's my producer surplus. And the size of that triangle is 2 units. It's 2 by 2 by a half, because it's a triangle. So I produce 2 units of producer surplus. It's the area of this triangle. Surplus is typically measured in dollars, yes, but you want to be a little bit careful, because when I have price per kilo here, so here it's a bit fiddly. Here the surplus is actually $2,000, because this is dollars per kilo and this is tons of apples. But normally, right, surplus is normally measured in dollars, because normally this is number of units, right? This is kilograms. This is quantity measured in kilograms. This is price measured in dollars per kilogram. And so areas on this are dollars per kilogram times kilograms. The unit analysis, the unit analysis says that this regions here are measured in dollars. So producer surplus is typically measured in dollars, yes. But I'm happy for you to be unit free, because we don't tend to worry about them too much. You would say the producer surplus here is, if you said in an exam, if you said 2, you would get full marks. If you said 2,000, you would get full marks. If you said $2, you'd get full marks. I'm not that concerned, basically, about the units. Does that address your question adequately? Cool, lovely. Otherwise, questions, concerns? Excellent. So, demand and supply. So we're going to bring together these two things, because we need to because that's where the power comes from. So demand curve, again, demand is this relationship between price and quantity. Supply is the relationship between price and quantity supplied. And so we can talk about when we can put these things on the same graph. So we can have a graph. Let's use numbers. 6, 2. We can have supply and demand on the same graph. Okay, and so we can talk about what happens at different prices. So at a given price, we're going to talk about there being excess demand, and excess demand is the same thing as saying there's a shortage when the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. When I'm at this high price here, right, a price of $5, the amount that is supplied, the amount that is demanded, nope, excess demand. When I'm at a nice price down here of $3, at this low price of $3, my market only wants to supply 1 ton of apples, 1 unit of goods, whereas my consumers want to consume 3 kilos or 3 units of this good, 3 tons of apples, whatever it is. And so we talk about there being excess demand, which is to say a shortage, because the quantity demanded at $3, the quantity demanded is 3, it's larger than the quantity supplied, which is only 1. So we talk about excess demand. We can talk about excess supply. So at a given price, at this nice high price of $5, at a price of $5, no one really wants to buy apples because that's really expensive. So we only have 1 unit of demand. But at a price of $5, all my apple producers are really happy with $5 and want to produce lots of apples. And I've drawn this really badly. And they want to produce $3. They want to produce 3 tons of apples at this price of $5. And so that gap there, right, this gap here, this is the size of the excess supply. And similarly, this gap here is the size of the excess demand. So we can talk about excess demand, excess supply. We can then also talk about the market conditions. At different price levels, we have different market conditions, excess demand, excess supply, etc. We can then talk about what we think will happen in a market that has excess demand or excess supply. If we're in this apple market that we have here, and the price is $3 in the market, right, then there's a huge amount of demand for this good at this there's this low price level of $3. There's a huge amount of demand for this good, and there's very few goods available on the market. Yeah? Because there's 3 tons worth of demand, there's only 1 ton worth of actually goods on the market. And if that's the case, and I'm a consumer, I might just go to a producer that's currently not producing and say, you know what, mate, I'll give you $1.50 for a ton of apples, or $1.50 per kilo for a ton of apples. And they'll go, and that's, $3.50 for a ton of apples, a little bit higher price. And as a consumer, that's great for me because I value this apple at quite a high level. I value this apple at more than $3.50. This is good for the producer because the producer's cost of production is less than that. The producer is very happy, the consumer is very happy, and that's going to drive the price up, right? Because now I'm paying $3.50 instead for this. I'm bringing more workers on. I'm bringing more production online, and so we see the price, and so we would expect the price to be pushed up from $3 because there's a shortage in the market. So consumers bid up the price, producers increase production to try to match that latent demand. And so the price gets pushed up. Similarly, if the price is very high, if the price is high enough that there's excess supply or a surplus of goods, then we're going to see prices being pushed down. Right? Up at the high price at $5 here, there's very little demand, there's tons of supply, and so as a supplier who's made all this material, who's made 3,000 kilos of apples, I can't sell it, so I'm going to discount a little bit. I'm going to sell it for a little bit less money instead of that $5 to try to get rid of these apples that I've got. So I'm going to be trying to sell off my apples by reducing the price. As the consumer, I want more apples, and so I'm going to, as a consumer, Yeah, well, as a consumer, this is really more one-sided. As a consumer, I'm going to take those discounts, and when I see those discounts, I'm going to buy more apples. And so in each case, we're getting pushed towards this equilibrium point here, towards this point where demand equals supply. And if we get to this point where demand equals supply, there's no incentive for anyone to do anything else. There's no incentive for either our producers or our consumers to try to push us away from this point. This is why we call this price level the equilibrium price level and equilibrium quantity level. Because when there is neither excess supply nor excess demand, the market's in equilibrium. And when we're in this point, there's no reason why the producers would want to try to increase or decrease prices. There's no reason why the consumers would want to try to bid higher or lower, because there's no room for movement. There's no room for additional profit by changing the price. This statement that quantity demanded is quantity supplied is called the market clearing condition. So we say the market clears when quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and the condition that says this is true is called the market clearing condition. Any questions? Questions, concerns, problems? The market clearing condition will end up being an equilibrium condition, yes, in appropriately well-behaved markets. This applies for price takers, which, yes, so broadly speaking, this applies for perfectly competitive markets. Yeah. So, yes, so for monopolies, different things happen. And we'll talk about monopolies in week 6. So we talk about imperfect competition in week 6, because in monopolies, the monopoly firm is not a price taker. The monopoly firm gets to choose their price. And so the analysis that we've done here is wrong, or is different. Right? This analysis assumes price-taking firms and assumes price-taking consumers as well. Yes, absolutely. Monopolies are different. I don't want to quite call this perfect competition. I mean, it is perfect competition, but perfect competition has lots of extra things in there as well that we'll talk about in week 5 when we talk about perfect competition. Any questions otherwise? Concerns? Lovely. So, now I'm going to do my spiel on why capitalism is good, or the good part of capitalism. So there are many ways to talk about the efficiency of economic outcomes. The one we normally do is Pareto efficiency. So a market outcome is Pareto efficient. So this was mentioned way back in the first week. Someone asked a question about this. A market outcome is Pareto efficient if the only way to make one person better off is to make someone else worse off. Right? This is what we call Pareto efficiency. Because there's lots of different types of efficiency. There's lots of ways we can talk about efficiency. But Pareto efficiency is one of them. So a market's Pareto efficient if the only way to make one person better off is to make someone else worse off. This is opinion, but it's my opinion, and it is a widely held opinion. Pareto efficiency, I want you to think of Pareto efficiency as a minimal requirement for an economic outcome to be considered even vaguely reasonable. If we're in a world which is not Pareto efficient, that means we can change things to make everyone better off. Right? If we can change things to make everyone better off, we should. Right? There's no reason not to do this. So Pareto efficiency really is our minimal requirement for something to be even vaguely reasonable. Right? And very, very rarely do people try to construct objects that are not Pareto efficient, because it would be silly. So, let's talk about Pareto efficiency. What are some of the things that we want, that we need to have in order for our market to be Pareto efficient? Right? We need all consumers to have the same marginal benefit. If different consumers have different marginal benefits for their last good consumed, again, the actual marginal benefits, the marginal benefit for the last good consumed, right? We're all having apples. The last apple I consumed, I gained 5 utils from. The last apple you consumed, you gained 10 utils from. And indeed, the next apple is much the same. This is not Pareto efficient. because my last apple was not particularly satisfying. His last apple was fantastic, so I should give my last apple to him and charge a small amount of money in exchange. And by doing so, we can both become better off by trading an appropriate amount of money. So at the very least, we need all of our consumers to have the same marginal benefit for that last good consumed. Or we can move, or the person with the low marginal benefit sells to the person with high marginal benefit. Similarly, we need all of our producers to have the same marginal cost of production for that last good that they produced. Because otherwise, the firm with high marginal cost can produce one less good, the firm with low marginal cost produces one more good, and the firm with high marginal cost just buys, instead of producing, just buys the good, right? And therefore, we can produce at a lower cost. We can make both of our firms better off by having the high marginal cost firm produce less, the low marginal cost firm produce more, and just trade money in such a way as both become better off. So all producers have to have the same marginal cost for that last unit they produce. We want that the marginal benefit for consumers and the marginal, and so the first one is related to demand, the second one to supply, and the third one is linking these things, which is that the marginal benefit for consumers and the marginal cost for firms or for producers have to be the same. Because otherwise, if these were different, say if the marginal benefit was higher than the marginal benefit for consumers was higher than the marginal cost for firms, then we can make everyone better off by having firms produce a bit more and sell it, right? Because there's that gap between marginal benefit and marginal cost. There's regions of additional net surplus that can be produced. So we want marginal benefit for consumers and the marginal cost for firms to be the same. And if we have these things, then we have Pareto efficiency. Right? As long as we have these things, then in our nice little simple market that we're working with, we're going to have Pareto efficiency. And if we don't have these things, then we don't have Pareto efficiency. And so this is where the equilibrium idea is really, really nice. Because, let's have an easier, because if we're at this nice equilibrium point here, right, if we're living at point A, if we're living here at nice point A here, we're in equilibrium. The market equilibrium is nice because it is efficient in the sense that it satisfies exactly these three statements. Because all of our consumers face the same price P, they're all going to keep consuming until their marginal benefit is exactly equal to the price they have to pay, which means they all have the same marginal benefit. They all have marginal benefit P or P naught, as I've drawn on this graph here. Because all producers in the market can sell their goods for the same price, P naught, they all supply until the marginal cost is equal to P naught. They keep producing more and more up until marginal cost is equal to the price. And so in particular, they all have the same marginal cost. And by transitivity, since the marginal benefit is the price and the marginal cost is also the price, the marginal benefit to consumers is also the same as the marginal cost. Marginal benefit to consumers is also the same as the marginal cost to producers. And so we get this nice, efficient outcome. The equilibrium outcome not only is an equilibrium in that no one wants to move away from here, it's also efficient in the sense that it is Pareto efficient, in the sense that the marginal benefit is the same for all consumers, the marginal cost is the same for all producers, and the marginal benefit is the same as the marginal cost. So this is fantastic. This is one of the reasons we really like the market structure, is because a standard market structure with perfect information and with perfect competition and with all these other things produces the equilibrium outcome, which is an efficient outcome as well. This is great. Any questions? Questions, comments, concerns? Yep. It's not a reality, no. The short answer is no, it's not a reality, because we're assuming it's an ideal circumstance. Because we're assuming, as I say, perfect competition, which we don't really have. We're assuming perfect information, which we don't really have. We're assuming no externalities, which we'll talk about next week, which we don't really have. So no, in practice you don't get this, but you often get close to this. So I've been using apples and bananas as examples a lot, and they are pretty close to this. right? In the sense that we do really satisfy most of the conditions for perfect competition. The externalities are pretty low. The informational issues are pretty low. There's lots of producers and lots of consumers. So in those kinds of markets, you get pretty close to this. But obviously, in practice, firms have at least a little bit of pricing power. All firms have at least a little bit of pricing power, and we assume all firms have none. So no, in practice, you don't get this level of perfection, but in practice, you will get varying degrees of close to this level of perfection. Something like apple production and banana production is going to be pretty close. Something like water is going to be weird because it's government monopoly. Something like computer operating systems is going to be very, very far from this story because there's one or two producers. There's one or two firms that can make this. Something like computer chips, very, very far from this story because there's two people that can make computer chips. The other point on this, the other limitation that I can talk about for this, is that efficiency is not the only aspect of market outcomes we might care about, right? The good part about this market structure is that we get efficiency, but efficiency is not everything. And so we can talk about, so efficiency is one aspect. There's no reason at all to think about the market outcome will result in any sort of notion of equality of outcome between consumers or firms, right? It's entirely possible that the market structure means that consumers basically get screwed or get very little surplus and firms get masses of surplus or vice versa. So there's no notion of equality built into this at all. There's no notion, and there's no notion of equality even between consumers, right? If I really, really like bananas and you only kind of like bananas, we both face the same price for bananas. So I, as a consumer, get a lot more total benefit than you do for bananas. It's just efficient in the sense that we have the same marginal benefit. We can't move things around to make one person better off without making another person worse off. So we can talk about equality. Equality we just don't have at all. We can talk about equity. Equity is tricky. You can talk about the market outcome being equitable because everyone gets treated the same at the outset. But that's not really what equity means. You can talk about it being inequitable because it doesn't take any effort to mitigate those kinds of outside influences. So we can talk about equality and equity and efficiency. The market is efficient. It's not market may be efficient. It's not necessarily equitable or not equal and not necessarily equitable. Any questions? Questions, concerns, issues here? Yes? Equilibrium, yep. Point A is yes. Point A is our equilibrium point, and it turns out that this also gets us nice Pareto efficient outcome. It's a minimum requirement. No, not necessarily. So the statement was if we can change, we should. If we were not Pareto, we definitely need to change. If we are Pareto efficient, the best possible world is Pareto efficient. But lots of not necessarily amazing worlds are also Pareto efficient. Pareto efficient is just the minimum requirement. But everywhere apart from A, in the real world, right? In this particular toy little model that we have here, everything apart from point A is not Pareto efficient. Yes, everything apart from A is just worse than A, absolutely. Once you have the supply curve and you have the demand curve, you cannot change things to be better than A. A is the best. Once you have the supply relationship and the demand relationship, you're stuck with these. You might be able to put in, if you were to put in new technology that reduces cost of production, you would typically see all boats rising, right? Everyone being better off. But for example, or if you made the product better so the demand curve shifted out, you would typically see everyone become better off. But no, once you have a fixed supply curve, you have a fixed demand curve, A is the best you can do. Okay, using the demand and supply model. So we'll go through this without too much fanfare. Oh good, we are actually almost done, because I won't talk about elasticity, or I will do it briefly. So the supply and demand model lets us think about what happens to equilibrium price and quantity when we face shocks to the market. This is kind of, in many ways, this is the nice thing about the demand and supply model, is we can talk about what happens when we change the market somehow. So, we talk about 3 key steps. There's going to be lots of questions in your problem set and in your mid-semester exam and in anything you ever do in economics, where we talk about shocks to a demand-supply model. We have a demand-supply model and we shock it somehow. And we talk about, there's a 3-step process to figuring out what goes on. You determine whether the shock affects supply or demand, because usually it'll affect one or the other, but not both. Not always, but usually. You think about how the curve shifts, whether it shifts outwards or inwards, or up or down, left or right. Then you look at the new equilibrium price and quantity. So you determine the new equilibrium price and quantity, and you can then talk about whether the price has gone up or down, whether the quantity produced, whether the quantity in the market's gone up or down. So you can talk about the change in equilibrium price and quantity. As I say, most shocks will affect only demand or only supply. So let's talk about some of these. The quality of food. So we're thinking about the market at Cambry again. The shock to our market is the quality of food at ANU residential halls dramatically increases. What do we think happens at the market for food in Cambry? Do we think this is going to affect demand in the Cambry market, or is it going to affect supply in the Cambry market? Who reckons demand? Hands up for demand. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Who reckons supply? A couple, not too many. I want to argue it's definitely demand, right? It's definitely a demand side issue because supply is a cost question, and the fact that food at somewhere else has gotten better, it doesn't affect my. If I'm a Cambry food producer, the fact that food elsewhere is now better quality has essentially no effect on my cost of production, right? It only affects demand, right? It affects demand, but if I'm a consumer of Cambry food, and let's say I live on a residential hall, and I'm trying to decide whether to have food at Cambry where I have to pay, and the food is better, but I have to pay, or food at the residential hall where it's free, or what I've already paid, I guess, but where it's free, if the quality of food at ANU increases, well then the demand for Cambry food is going to go down. Cambry's going to have to charge a lower price to get me to go out and buy their food. And so, ceteris paribus, again, all else being equal, we would expect demand for Cambry food to shift down. So we expect demand to shift down to D prime, or D1. I don't mind what notation you use here. D1, D prime, these are all fine. This is the little prime symbol. I'm happy with whatever symbology you want to use. And we can think about then, so this is what happens to demand. Demand shrinks. And so we can talk about what happens to price and quantity sold in Cambry. And we see that our new equilibrium point B, in Cambry less food is sold, and it's sold at a lower price. Some people do this in multiple steps. If you want to do it in multiple steps, I'm happy with that. If you're happy to do it in one step like this, I'm happy with that as well. If you do this in multiple steps, you can talk about demand decreases. And so at the original price that they were charging, they're just not selling any goods. Right? Cambry food sellers still try and sell at the original price P0 for a short time, and they're just not selling. There's this massive excess supply in the market because all these people that used to come into Cambry are instead just staying in their residential hall and eating that food there. And so to try to encourage people back in, Cambry reduces prices, Cambry pushes the prices down to try to get people back into the market, try to close off that excess supply. And they're going to keep reducing price until we reach a new equilibrium at point B, which we can describe as a partial success. Right? Canterbury has partially succeeded in clawing back those consumers. They don't fully succeed, right? There's still, total quantity produced still falls because it's not worth reducing the price by so much that everyone comes back. It's just not worth it for the producers. But it is worth it for the producers to reduce price a little bit to get some of those people back. So we will typically see a move from A to B as producers reduce costs, as the price being sold in the market falls gradually over time. Questions, concerns, problems? Yes. The red part, so the question is what would be expected to show. The red part's very much optional, very, very optional. I would be expecting as a minimum requirement, and I'll talk about minimum requirements later, as a minimum requirement, you need to have, we move from A to B. In equilibrium, we start at point A. The fall in demand means we move to point B. Price falls, quantity sold also falls. And the big story about producers face about there being excess supply causing prices to be falling. It's something you can add, but it's not part of the minimum requirements for a solution. But it's something you could add. Yeah, that narrative of the red line narrative there, you can include, but it's not part of the minimum requirements. Questions otherwise? Problems? Okay, I have two more of these I want to talk about, so let's push through. ACT police declare they will no longer issue fines for marijuana production, only for use. Seems like the opposite of the way that they intend to go, but a declaration is made. That they will no longer issue fines for production, they will only issue fines for using marijuana. What do we think? Will this affect, who thinks this will affect the demand for marijuana? Supply of marijuana? Hey, lots of people, excellent. Yeah, this is clearly a supply curve issue. If I'm using marijuana, I don't really care about whether there are fines attached to producing it because I'm not producing it, I'm just using it. So demand is not going to be affected. It's a supply question. And we would expect to see supply increasing. It's now easier and cheaper to produce this product because I'm not constantly worried about the threat of fines from the government. And so we see supply shifts outwards. So at the same price, I'm willing to sell more goods. This is what our supply shifting outwards means. And so we can talk about what happens to the price and quantities, equilibrium price and quantity. And we just see, very straightforwardly, equilibrium price and quantity shift to P1, Q1. So equilibrium quantity increases, equilibrium price falls. And again, you can talk about this in terms of initially at the original price, there's excess supply, and so we draw down the price in order to sell all the new product that we're producing. Right, so the other story here. We have all this lovely excess supply, and so we push the price down towards this new equilibrium, the new equilibrium at point B. Any questions, concerns? Excellent. And finally, the hard one. There is a substantial increase in the minimum wage. So I believe the Labor government in Australia is currently arguing for basically what amounts to a substantial increase in the minimum wage. by shifting to a living wage. We're talking about quite a non-trivial increase. Oh, I didn't change this. Whoops. Ignore where it says pop-up village hubs. It should say Canberra. Let's talk about Canberra market. So if there's a big increase in the minimum wage, it also affects ANU workers. So we want to think about what happens in the Canberra market in this setting. If I talk about a big increase in minimum wage, is this going to affect demand? Who reckons this will affect demand? Some. Who reckons it affects supply? Some. Both are right? This is going to affect both demand and supply because it's going to be an income effect for all of the workers, all of our workers, all the people buying the good. Sorry, I shouldn't say workers.